Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another event in the Institute of Politics Speaker Series. My name is Steve Edwards, the Executive Director of the IOP, and it's great to have all of you with us tonight for our conversation featuring David Maraniss and LZ Granderson here on the subject of David's new book, focused on Detroit. The title is Once in a Great City, A Detroit Story. And some of you may have seen there are copies of the book available for purchase. David has kindly agreed to sign some of them after this session is over tonight. So our special thanks to the University of Chicago Bookstore for providing books for tonight's event. I wanted to say just a couple of brief words before I turn it over to Adam Reynolds, who will actually formally introduce both of our speakers tonight. One is, I think those of you who are familiar with David Maraniss's work know just what a prodigious, extensive, researcher he is, and what just a beautiful writer and accomplished storyteller he is. And my own firsthand account most recently came when the opportunity surfaced to interview him a couple of years ago for WBEZ, my former employer. And over the course of 571 pages, voluminously noted with an entire array of source notes and endnotes, he told us the story of Barack Obama's entire life, all the way to the point before he entered politics. It's pretty remarkable. 571 pages, and the guy hadn't even entered the realm of state government, let alone the presidency. And LZ Granderson, of course, is a familiar face to many of you here. LZ is a former fellow at the IOP. He is now teaming up with a current fellow at the IOP, Matthew Dowd, for a digital series for ABC News that some of you may have caught after some of the presidential debates. Most recently, they'll be back at it tomorrow night doing a recap and analysis. And I like to think of your bond, even though it had nothing to do with us, as just the magic of the IOP forming new political bridges. So thank you so much for being here tonight, LZ. It's always good to have you with us. Speaking of digital content, The X-Files is our new podcast hosted by our very own David Axelrod. If you haven't subscribed, I highly recommend it. You can download it via iTunes, an extraordinary series of one-on-one conversations featuring behind-the-scenes chats with some of the most important players in politics today. That's at iTunes. We will take time for your questions in the middle of today's conversation. So LZ will pause and we'll put a microphone out into the audience. We ask that when we do, you keep your questions short and to the point so we can get to as many of you tonight as possible. So with that long preamble, let me turn the podium over to Adam Reynolds, who is a student here at the University of Chicago studying economics and public policy. He's been very active at the IOP, where he has twice been a Fellows Ambassador, most recently for LZ Granderson and Laura Washington. He's also leading an on-campus effort to register students to vote through TurboVote. So please join me in welcoming Adam Reynolds to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and welcome to this IOP Speaker Series event. It's my pleasure to introduce a conversation with LZ Granderson and David Maraniss on the rise and fall of the Motor City. David Maraniss is an associate editor at the Washington Post, and he's the author of 6 critically acclaimed and best-selling books, ranging in topic from baseball to the White House. Mr. Maraniss is a recipient of numerous journalistic awards, and has been a 3-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and received the 1993 Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of Bill Clinton's presidential campaign. His most recent book, Once in a Great City, A Detroit Story, begins with 1963 Detroit, a city filled with characters who are poised to become some of America's great visionaries. Automakers are enjoying their best year, and Detroit is at the center of a revolution in music and politics. Detroit saw the rise of progressive labor movements, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech before it came to Washington, and the creation of some of America's most iconic muscle cars. Leading tonight's discussion about this city's storied history and the path that led us to the present is Mr. LZ Granderson. LZ Granderson is a commentator and contributor for ESPN and ABC. He's well known for his coverage of the intersection of sports and politics, and has received recognition from the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation and the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, who named him Journalist of the Year in 2011. Additionally, just before I came in here, I understand that LZ won an Emmy this past weekend for his work with ESPN, and we'd like to congratulate him for that as well. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Maraniss and Mr. Granderson, 2 Detroit natives.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having us. As a born and raised Detroiter, as soon as I saw the invitation, I was very excited because Detroit gets such bad press from people. It's nice to talk about some of the good things of Detroit, both its past as well as its future. And before we begin, David, I would like to run off a list of names here that I'm sure you would know the connection, but maybe shocking to some people out here. Lily Tomlin.
Detroit.
Tom Selleck.
Detroit.
Gilda Radner. Detroit. Ed McMahon.
I didn't know that one.
Francis Ford Coppola. Alice Cooper. Jerry
Yes.
Bruckheimer.
Yes.
And then this name really threw me for a loop. Sonny Bono of Sonny and Cher. Born in Detroit. So my first question
I would come up with a better list.
Well, I went on the quirky list.
Okay.
So my first question is to you. These are some legendary names
Yeah,
that no one connects to Detroit.
right.
Why?
Because they left. I've heard Lily Tomlin talk about Detroit. I haven't heard many of the others, actually. Certainly not.
Tom Selleck.
Well, he
doesn't
came
ring a
back
bell.
and played a tiger once, didn't he?
He
In
did,
B
in a really
movie?
bad movie,
Yeah.
yeah. We don't talk about that much.
And, Alice Cooper, there's a lot of, I write about Motown in the book, but there are a lot of different genres of music that came out of Detroit. MC5, and just a lot of them in different eras, or the Detroit area, I should say. But I think, I don't know whether that answer says, I honestly don't know whether that says more about Detroit or just about the way people who rise leave their roots. But certainly, I was born in Detroit, and I don't know how much I talked about it until I wrote this book. Maybe.
And you were inspired by a Detroiter to write this book,
I
correct?
definitely was. Yeah, no, it was, I often say that for the 7 larger books that I've written, I have to be obsessed to write them. Mm-hmm. And so something has to catch not just sort of my sense of sociological themes that I'm interested in, but something that comes close to my heart and soul. And this one came to me in the most unlikely way. LZ was getting on me earlier because I'm a Green Bay Packer fan instead of a Lions fan. But I actually spent most of all the glory years of the Packers, I was living in Wisconsin. But so I was at a bar in New York City on Super Bowl Sunday of 2011. Packers were playing the Steelers. I was an anxious fan. I was actually in the bar with the cast of the Lombardi play on Broadway that was inspired by my book. So it was kind of surreal. I was standing next to Dan Lauria. Some of you might remember him as the father on The Wonder Years. And he played Lombardi on Broadway. I'm standing next to him, looking up at the screen. At halftime, there's a little skit about Lombardi, and Lauria's on TV. Then I look up again, and I saw a commercial with a freeway sign that said Detroit. And I started watching. And I saw the Joe Louis Fist and the Diego Rivera murals of Detroit industry, and this sedan driving down what appeared to be Woodward Avenue. And then Eminem, the Detroiter, was in the car. I'm too old to be an Eminem guy, but I'm starting to become one now. And it was a really hypnotic beat, and the visuals were just beautiful, even of the ruins. Everything about it was beautiful. And then he gets out of the sedan and walks into the glorious Fox Theater on Woodward and walks down the aisle, and there's this black gospel choir rising in song. And Eminem turns to the camera and says, "This is the Motor City, and this is what we do." And I choked up. I literally had tears in my eyes. And my wife, who's not here tonight so I can tell the story because she doesn't like it, she basically said, "You sucker, why are you falling for that? They're selling Chryslers, and Detroit's a mess." But it got me thinking about why it affected me that way, what Detroit meant to me. And then I started thinking about what Detroit meant to the whole country. And that got me on the way to this book.
You were born in Detroit, and then you moved away to Wisconsin before high school. Can you describe for us a little bit what your Detroit looked like?
Yeah, we lived on Dexter, a mile up from the Y, Grand River Boulevard, in an area that had been traditionally Jewish, but was very integrated at this point in the early and mid 1950s. So my memories are going to learning to read at an integrated elementary school, Winterhalter Elementary. My mother in the Christmas season worked at Hudson's Department Store, the iconic, I think the tallest department store in the world at that point. I remember my earliest memories are of Verner's ginger ale. So strong it would go up your nose. I just loved Verner's ginger ale. And of the Boblo boat. One traumatic memory was my mom would put me on the bus on Dexter down to the Fisher Y. At 6 years old, and I'd get off and have to go into this freezing pool swimming naked with other 6-year-olds. So I had the trauma of that. But my father worked at the Detroit Times, a defunct Hearst newspaper. So a lot of strong memories from that period that really sort of they unearthed after I started thinking about Detroit, but always part of the family lore.
Were you surprised at all at its decline? I know there's been research that was done at Wayne State University back in the 50s that kind of predicted the decline, but just because there's a study that predicts a decline doesn't mean the emotional impact of the decline registers. Were you shocked by that?
Well, the decline had actually started well before that. Wayne State sociologists in '63 said we're going to lose 500,000 population by the end of the decade, and that will continue for the foreseeable future. They were right. With it taking away the tax base. When I got into the book, I say jokingly that we stayed at a bed and breakfast called the Inn on Ferry Street, near the Detroit Institute of Arts. And every morning I'd walk across Woodward Avenue to the fabulous Walter Reuther Library and Archive. It has all the records I needed, basically, most of them. And I felt like I could stop in the middle of Woodward Avenue and read War and Peace and not get hit by a car. It felt that desolate 4 years ago. But I'd visited Detroit a few times over the decades after I left. I hadn't spent any time studying the city. I knew about its decline, and the fact that it was essentially a one-company town and what the auto industry did to leave the city, that didn't surprise me. I knew some of the racial history of the city because my mother, during World War II, when my dad was, my father was the commander of an all-black unit in World War II, and my mother was working in the defense plants. And she would tell a story about the riots of 1943 and how people were being pulled off a streetcar and some African-American gentleman protected her. But it was an incredibly difficult time. So I knew a little bit of that history. I didn't know much about the history of Detroit's racial tensions over decades. And so there was a lot for me to learn about its decline. But my first job as a newspaperman was in Trenton, New Jersey, so I knew certainly about northern cities' industrial decline. And Detroit is just sort of an exaggeration of that in every respect.
In your research and in writing your book, what bit of information really shocked you?
LZ, this sounds gratuitous, but I try to approach everything I do as a surprise, that I know nothing. Because, in our profession, you get so encrusted with assumptions that it's really important for me to start from scratch. So I looked at everything as a surprise. Ranging from the role that Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown's sisters, played in Motown, who get no credit for it, but really were very instrumental to him and the rise of Motown, to the effects of, I knew that urban renewal maybe starts with good intentions, but generally has negative results. But I was sitting in the office of Reverend Nicholas Hood, who was 90 years old and had a church in the area that was decimated by urban renewal. And he took out a map that he kept, and he showed it to me, of what the city planners of that area, and it didn't even list the black churches. That shocked me. I shouldn't have, but it was just so stunning that it upset me, I should say. But I'm always looking for new ways to tell stories that people think they're familiar with. So everything I did, I want to think of was a surprise in one way or another.
How did you choose the particular characters or people in Detroit to focus in on your book?
Well, first I started with themes. The first motivation after I saw that commercial was, what can I do? Well, I write, so I'll write. What can I write about? Well, I'm not a financial writer, and financial writing bores me, really. And I know that the bankruptcy is very important, but it's not what I do, and it's not what I should try to do. So what can I do? I write nonfiction, narrative, sociology, biography. So I started with that concept of themes, and the 4 themes were the auto industry, Motown, labor, and Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, and civil rights. And those 4 larger themes took me to the characters. So, if you're going to write about the auto industry, you got to write about Ford. I mean, because Henry Ford II, the Deuce, the grandson of the founder, is by far the most colorful of the characters in the auto industry of that period.
Did you just call him the Deuce?
I did. That was his nickname.
Okay. Does it mean something totally different right now? So I just want to make sure you clarify that.
So inform me.
I think we'll leave
that. Okay.
We'll leave that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, make the Deuce. No, I know. But that was his nickname. So that came naturally. Lee Iacocca was at Ford then. I didn't really want to write much about Iacocca. He's sort of overblown, but he was involved in the creation of the Mustang, which I did want to write about. Walter Reuther, I consider one of the great under-recognized figures of 20th century American social history. I definitely wanted to write about him. Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha's father, came into the story because he's the one who invited Martin Luther King to Detroit for the Great Walk to Freedom. And what an incredibly flamboyant character he was. He and Henry Ford II are kind of parallel in some ways. Very flaboyant, over the top. The Deuce's motto was never complain, never explain, and that could have held for Reverend Franklin too, I think, Aretha's dad. And Jerome Kavanaugh, the mayor, and the police commissioner, George P. Edwards, sort of to me represented progressive thinkers of that period who, for various reasons, couldn't quite control or didn't quite have what was needed to sustain their dreams, which is what happened in Detroit. So Kavanaugh was a sort of an acolyte of John F. Kennedy, Irish Catholic. He even trained his kids like he was Joseph Kennedy, making them wear suits and play touch football and all this stuff. And he was elected because of the African-American vote in 1961. It was the previous mayor, Louis Mariani, and the reactionary police department that really brought a reaction to that, brought Kavanaugh into office. And he appointed as his police commissioner George Edwards, who was a remarkable figure, and his papers are at the Reuther's library too, who had come up through the auto. He first came to Detroit as a union organizer, a socialist, who wanted to write a book like The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, about Detroit. And he was sort of tutored by the Reuther brothers, and then got into politics in Detroit, and then was appointed to the Michigan Supreme Court. Long history of caring about progressive issues. He actually resigned from the Michigan Supreme Court to take the job as police commissioner when Kavanaugh asked him to. And he did it for the sole purpose of trying to improve race relations in the city. So then to see what happens over the next several years is sort of...
You've just run off a name of some incredibly influential, gifted, talented, dedicated, well-meaning human beings. What went wrong?
So much. Part of Detroit's decline is representative of the difficulties that all urban cities, all big cities face, including Chicago, in terms of race in particular. So in that sense, I think in Detroit, as I said, urban renewal had a devastating rippling effect on the city. But there was already this deep racial tension in Detroit going back to the riot of World War II and even earlier when, Kevin Boyle is here today and he wrote a brilliant book about it, an early effort of an African-American family to move into a white neighborhood. And there's a long history of vigilante squads in Detroit, the tensions between the white working class Appalachian migration and the great African-American migration from Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana and Mississippi. It just kept bubbling up over various times with the police department making things worse. So that's part of it, that racial divide and leading to white flight and the urban renewal making, not only tearing apart the traditional black neighborhoods of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, but also making it easier for all these freeways for people to get out of town. And then common to all cities, the suburbs sort of strangled it with the development of the shopping malls on each end. And then you had, peculiar to Detroit, the auto industry sort of leaving the city over the course of many, many years, but by the time of my book, 63, it essentially abandoned the city emotionally as well as leaving it in so many other physical ways. So all of that combined, the one company town and all the other issues made it very, this is before the riots of 67, it's before the, people blaming everything on the hefty pension plans for city employees or much later corrupt mayors. Before all that, the structural problems were there.
Do you think the city, I made light of the conversation before, in terms of Detroit getting, bad press and a bad rap. Having written this book, having been born there and spent some time there, having spent time there on the back end,
Right.
Is the city getting a bad rap at this point?
I think it's changing week by week. I really do. I've felt, I've gone back, since I started writing the book, I've been there 12 times. And 4 times, and I'm going back again tomorrow, since the book came out. And I think I've seen a buzz, certainly, and an energy. I mean, I'm a trained journalist and writer, and so I'm naturally skeptical, but optimistic. That's just my nature to be optimistic. So that's about where I am with Detroit. Skeptical, but optimistic. I see, certainly in the downtown, you see a lot of new restaurants coming in. Dan Gilbert, the billionaire, buying up a lot of office buildings, but there is an energy there in downtown. The Midtown area near Wayne State and the Detroit Institute of Arts, all the students here, move to Detroit. It's a great place to go. There are a lot of kids coming in there now. I sort of jokingly say it's like the new Brooklyn, except, who wants to be in Brooklyn,
Well, it's funny you were mentioning that, like you, I go back to Detroit quite often, and the thing that, in talking to grassroots leaders there, that's a concern, particularly grassroots leaders of color, is that because of the gentrification, like Brooklyn,
Totally.
the pure Detroiters can no longer afford to actually live in Detroit.
Isn't that true? And that, that's going on in Washington, D.C. too, and in a lot of cities where there's this gentrification process. Detroit, it's more than just that, because, the gentrification is still in a pretty limited area.
I walked downtown and I didn't see a black person for like 10 minutes, and I was like thrown. Like all I saw was white people, and I was like going, oh my God, where am I?
But you're right. There's still, there's so much of Detroit that's getting left behind still. So, I believe deeply that until you deal with the whole city, it's not really a revitalization. And I know that tension between, longstanding African-American Detroiters and what's going on with this quote-unquote renaissance. Yeah, it's there.
Do you feel the city, Because you talk about its heyday, and in its
Right.
heyday, its infrastructure was built for like 1.2, 1.3 million people.
2 million.
It's like a third of that now in terms
Yeah.
of population now. Do you
Right.
believe the city needs to shrink in order to have a full recovery?
How does it shrink? I don't see how you do it. I mean, what happens to the area that you've shrunk? I mean, it doesn't, you see, I mean, it's still a physical entity. And, you know, if you shrink it, you know, does the part that you shrink become like Highland Park, which is so bad that the Detroit schools are better? You know, I mean, I don't think that's the answer. I think that some of it is dealing with the vast number of abandoned houses, but some of those houses shouldn't be abandoned. They should not be repossessed, you know? So there's a two-edged sword there, too. But it's a huge geographic city, as you know. I mean, it's, I think, 28 miles across.
Right.
Huge. I don't think you can shrink it, but you got to figure out what to do with it, you know, build clusters around it. And, you know, so you can't focus everything on the downtown and the midtown. How you do that is, if you had all of those answers, this would be a magical world, you know? But there definitely has to be, and I spent a day with Mayor Duggan, the new mayor, and you know, he's got something going, you know. He's very focused on every neighborhood. You know, we took out these maps and he showed me every single neighborhood in the city and knew something about it and what the plan was. The Obama administration, basically unknown to the world, has a group of people just working on Detroit. They don't have that. The only other city I think in the country that has that is Baltimore, after the Baltimore riot. But there are 4 guys who come out of the White House, not out of any of the departments, and are working on Detroit with the mayor. And so they're doing everything from street lights to figuring out the specific neighborhood where they want to relocate Syrian refugees. Near the border with Dearborn, where there's already a large Arab population. So, you know, I think he's got there's some other corridors that he's working on that I visited that, you know, who knows? I mean, he's a booster, he's the mayor, but I saw things going that were a little bit more positive than I expected.
You know, the city of Chicago, much like Detroit, is facing some really difficult pension bills
Yeah,
right now. And part of the, I don't know if you want to call it a scare tactic or a reality check, but the rhetoric has been, if we aren't careful, we're going to end up like Detroit. Do you think that's, based upon what you've researched and what you know of Detroit, do you think the same scenario is here in place in Chicago where that could happen?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that it could have a serious problem with the pensions, but that was just one of the many problems with Detroit. And I think Chicago has the race problem, I think, and it has the pension problem.
Right.
And it has a school problem. But 2 of those 3 are common to every big city. But Chicago has much more economic vitality than Detroit. It's not even in the same ballpark for that. So you know, if you're just talking about the city as a totality or as an entity, it's not the same. But for individual lives, it can be very much the same.
I'd like to open it up now for a few questions out in the crowd. Oh, there's a hand waving there in the distance. If you can hold on 1 second, we have microphones heading your way. We just want to make sure that it's on videotape here, so we can hear your excellent question.
You said something about the attitude of people, of the city fathers, the rich, you know, the industrialists and so forth, toward Detroit, that they really didn't, that was one of the problems. Is
Yeah.
that because they love the industry but not the city? Is there some kind of thing there where they never really loved it as a city?
Well, if you just took the case of Ford, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, hated cities. Everything he stood for was against what's, you know, he propagated this pastoral myth. You know, if you've ever visited Greenfield Village, you'll see all this mythology the McGuffey Reader and a farmhouse. And yeah, no, he despised cities partly because of what they brought, which was people from all over the world. He was, to give him credit, he did hire a lot of African Americans from the South, but he was an incredible anti-Semite and really hated anything that was foreign or alien to what he considered the American ideal. And so that was really, I call that the infected heart of Detroit, starting with Henry Ford, who's kind of the symbol of that industry, yes. And there are many other examples after that, but that's the founding principle of that abandonment.
There's a question up front here.
When demographers list cities in America, starting with the most segregated cities among large cities, the two that vie for first and second are Chicago and Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
And you cited the 1943 incidents as examples of hatred. I was always wondering, why are these two cities at the top of the list? And the only thing I could come up with in my mind, which is from the period that predates your period, 1963, is that the industrialists in both cities used African Americans as strike breakers. When the strikes occurred in the auto plants in the 1930s and the very early 1940s, Henry Ford used African Americans as strike breakers. In the packing houses in Chicago, African Americans were used by the industrialists as strike breakers. And I wondered if you came across anything that indicated that the hatred that was created from that period was still spilling over in the 1960s.
It certainly was still spilling over. I think that's only one of the factors of that. I mean, I think that whatever tensions there were in the plants were very real. And, in World War II, there are incredible quotes and instances of white auto workers saying they'd rather work for Hitler than with, N-words by their side. So, yeah, I mean, that was definitely part of it. And the manipulation of African American workers in that sense certainly fueled some of that. But I would say that just enhanced the racist attitudes that were there in the first place. And part of it was Chicago also had a very large influx of the white working class from Appalachia come to Chicago, right? As did Detroit. And so there were these two competing forces coming up to these two major industrial cities, at the same time. And as well as a lot of Eastern European ethnic neighborhoods in both cities, where there was a very strong sense of we don't want anybody who's not like us to live here. So I think that housing had a lot to do with it and jobs. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, sure. No, sure. I'm just. Can we get a microphone up here, please? Thank you.
Hi, so I grew up recently in Metro Detroit, Oakland County, and one of the things that a lot of people view as striking is that despite Detroit's economic total collapse, the suburbs are consistently doing very well, especially if you look at, Grosse Pointe, Bloomfield Hills, West Bloomfield, that area. Did you see any stuff in the 80s or 90s where people were talking about kind of the conflict between the two? Especially, I heard there were some plans that never got terribly far about Detroit possibly annexing Grosse Pointe to substantially increase its tax base, but that obviously never got off the ground.
Nor would it. The 80s and 90s were not in my field of vision. I'm writing about the 60s, and and I was there today, so I'm much more aware of those two periods and before the 60s than the period in between. But you're right. I mean, the ring around Detroit is quite wealthy. I was telling this woman who's a very progressive woman in Madison, Wisconsin, on the state Supreme Court. I'm doing all these visits to Detroit, and she said, "Oh, I love Detroit." And turns out she'd never actually been in the city. She goes to these judicial conferences, in Birmingham or Bloomfield Hills or something. So there's no question. I mean, it depends on which direction you go in terms of the suburbs, obviously. If you go to Macomb County, there's a lot of the auto workers who lived in Detroit moved out there. But when you go to the Northwest, yeah, I mean, it's as vibrant and wealthy as any place in the country, just about. And the connection between Oakland County in particular and Detroit is intense and immense, where their county executive, hates Detroit and uses it as the symbol of everything that's evil in America. So he's got no plans to help Detroit. But I did find, when talking to auto executives today, who live out in the suburbs, and, for in the case of Ford, they're based out there, they regret that they left Detroit behind. 50 years too late, but they sort of realized that it was the heart of the industry that they represent, not just physically, but emotionally, and that they needed Detroit to be thriving for a lot of other deeper reasons.
I didn't know that I need a mic.
Oh, we just want to make sure we get your brilliant question on video.
So as a former reporter, I'm going to ask a two-part question, that each part of which is completely unrelated to the other, but I'm going to pretend it's one question. The first is, you wrote about Walter Reuther extensively and his role there, and he was a progressive force in that era and within the labor movement. But the labor movement changed. I mean, he died in 1970, but the labor movement changed even during the course of your 19-month exploration. Can you talk a little bit about that and what happened to Reuther and the labor movement and the UAW and the dynamics of the UAW during that period? And the second is talk about the another institution you wrote about, which is Motown. We had this discussion a little bit earlier. Why is it that Motown I know why it was called Motown, but why did the sound emerge in Detroit and not Chicago or Cleveland or some other cities that all had musical influences, were part of the Great Migration and so on?
Yeah, Walter Reuther, to start with, was, a really fascinating figure who had all of these, dealing with these contradictory forces. The United Auto Workers, when he came up, had a very strong communist wing that he fought against, and then the auto industry was a reactionary force. So they both hated Walter Reuther in different ways. Matter of fact, when there was an assassination attempt on him earlier, nobody for a while was quite sure which side might have done it. But he was beaten by Ford Motor Company goons, and there's no doubt about who did that one. But he was dealing with, I would say, he was an outsider on the inside. He loved to be near presidents. He was very close to Kennedy and then became close to Johnson, too. And he was considered an establishment figure, but he was pushing pretty hard on, especially on civil rights in that era, pushing Kennedy to be stronger on it, to not compromise with the Southern senators, to declare Mississippi unconstitutional, basically. I mean, a lot of things like that. But yet he was representing a union that was made up of a lot of these auto workers were living in these neighborhood enclaves that were fighting as vigilantes against African Americans coming in, and he was pushing civil rights. So there was that tension between the top and the bottom of his union, which eventually led to a lot of those auto workers bailing out to Macomb County and voting for Ronald Reagan. The Reagan Democrats, a lot of them were auto workers. So it's just one of those contradictions of life and the forces that were buffeting Walter Reuther. I consider, I read at the Reuther Library, they have all of his speeches, and he was really, his speeches were very, very prescient about the technological changes that were coming. The Great Society, in many ways, is Reuther's dream. He would talk about how the government, bigness is part of 20th century life. Big corporations, big government, and the question is how you deal with it, how it deals with human beings. You can debate all you want about bigness, but he was right about the technological dehumanization that might come with that unless you did it right. He really saw that very strongly. And he was also pushing for smaller cars. He was trying to get the big three to build smaller, less expensive cars. So he was interesting in a lot of ways. But that by the time he died in 1970 in a plane crash, George Wallace was already on the scene, and many of his workers were voting for George Wallace in the Michigan primary. Motown, to completely change the subject, what drew me to Motown, first of all, it was the music. I usually write in peace and quiet, but for this book, I was blasting, the whole time. My wife knew when I was writing because she could hear it. So aside from my just love of all those characters, think about a bus leaving Detroit in October of 1962 carrying little Stevie Wonder at age 13, Marvin Gaye, the Miracles, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Martha and the Vandellas, the Marvelettes, Mary Wells, and an opening act called the Supremes, and nobody was sure if they'd make it or not. And the Temptations would sing backup for Mary Wells. Just an incredible collection of talent. So how did it happen? Why did it happen in Detroit then? And this doesn't even include Aretha Franklin, who was also from Detroit, the daughter of Reverend C.L. Franklin. And the story is that Reverend Franklin thought that Motown was beneath his daughter, so he sent her to New York. But anyway, so why did it happen in Detroit? Part of it is, in my opinion, because of the entrepreneurial genius of the Gordy family. Berry Gordy in particular had a lot of flaws, but he was particularly good at figuring out how to make a product and how to make it sell and how to find talent. And his sisters were also very instrumental in all of that. Part of it was much like Chicago, the Great Migration bringing African Americans to the city with the oral traditions of blues and jazz and church singing. Part of it was the tensions within Motown. I think the competition every week for who would get their song produced was a sort of creative tension that helped the fervor of it. Berry Gordy often would lose out. His sisters would vote against him and vote for a Smokey Robinson song, but they were all trying to get it. But then the two other factors that fascinated me the most. One was pianos. Detroit, as I said, vast single-family houses for miles and miles, disposable income of the working class, so that every musician I interviewed talked about the piano in their house. Mostly made by Grinnell Brothers, and sold by Grinnell Brothers, a local company that was the largest manufacturer for many decades of pianos in the country, and sold them at reasonable prices to everybody. And the final factor were public school music teachers. Literally every musician I interviewed remembered their music teachers, even elementary school. I interviewed Martha Reeves, and she remembered Emily Wagstaff, her elementary school music teacher. And then she told me the story of how, as a 16-year-old, she was plucked out of the chorus to sing an aria. Her senior high music teacher believed in teaching them the classics and the fundamentals. And so he had them all singing an opera, and she was chosen to sing the aria. And I've said this before, it's kind of thrilling that on tape, I have recordings of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Muhammad Ali and many, many world figures But one of the most fun is the one of Martha Reeves singing this opera, at age 71. So I think all of those factors, the pianos, the music teachers, the oral tradition, and the Gordy family, and just the coincidence of proximity, of all these people living so close together. The other thing they all talked about, it's probably part of that oral tradition, but Smokey and many of the others would talk about everybody was singing. You'd be on a street corner and everybody, there'd be little groups just singing everywhere. So it's just part of the culture. Thank you.
Let's grab a student here.
I noticed with great interest in your bibliography, you included Jeffrey Eugenides' book Middlesex.
Yes.
And that got me thinking about how novelists give us a great sense of place. In fact, there's a new book on New York in the 1970s that's out, and it's 900 pages. Supposedly it's so vivid that the smells and the sounds get recreated in these novels. And in the crowded, busy world of nonfiction, I'm just kind of curious, what are you setting out to do? How do you make your book stand out so that people will want to read your story? I mean, what is the goal? What are you setting out to do?
Well, I can't answer that without sounding self-serving, but I set out to get people that if they read it, they'll read it to the very last word. That's my first goal. And then my second goal is to bring something to life so they feel that they're there. These are not in prioritized order, but and then the third is to illuminate. But I'm a storyteller first. I mean, everything I write is based on fact, or at least, I cite everything in the back of my books. I don't make people think that they don't know where it's coming from.
You're not Ben Carson? Is that what you're trying to say? Is that too soon? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, all memoirists are like that. I mean, yeah, you could go off on all of them. And some nonfiction writers don't source their material either. I'm not a trained historian, but historians tend to appreciate what I do. But my first goal is to illuminate a world in a way that people read it and learn something from it. And I'm a nonfiction writer my whole life, but I think nonfiction can be as much of a storytelling enterprise as any novel. And that novel you mentioned, City of Fire, it's got great writing in it, but historically it's total BS, So I mean, I think that my goal is to try to do both.
You ever stopped?
And Middlesex, on the other hand, is great in every respect.
Did you ever stop in the middle of a book? You talked earlier about how you have to be completely passionate about a subject in order to write about it. Did you ever think you were passionate about a subject, got into it, and it was like, maybe not so much, and left it on the shelf?
I've been lucky. I haven't had that happen. I did do a book on Al Gore, but it was based on a series I did for the Washington Post. So it wasn't. I don't consider it one of my 7 larger books. And nothing against Al Gore.
He won't see this.
And there's
This will be
actually
fine.
some parts of his life that are fascinating. His relationship with his dad is really pretty interesting. But I wasn't obsessed with it. But of the 7, what I consider my 7 larger books, each one began with there were a couple where I was afraid. And actually the book that was the hardest for me was my first one on Bill Clinton. Because it was my first biography. I knew a lot about him, and in the last 3 months of writing it, I just kept beating myself up, saying, well, you're a biographer, make up your mind. Do you like the guy or not? And I just kept going at it, and I didn't get writer's block, but I was really, really depressed, trying to figure my way out of it. And I've often said of so many things in life, the obvious becomes obvious only when it's obvious. And the obvious thing was, I hated him and I liked him. They're both there. And they're inseparable. And of course, that's true of every human being, that there's everybody has contradictions in them. Clinton's just an exaggeration of all of that. And so I couldn't separate the two, and by bringing them together and explaining why they're inseparable, that was the book. That's the biography. And so that's the closest I've come. But, for Vince Lombardi, again, he was a very contradictory figure. There were times when I didn't like him. But on the other hand, the most common phrase attributed to Vince Lombardi is winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Sort of the pathology of a win at all costs idea. But he didn't say it. It was first uttered publicly by a 13-year-old actress in a John Wayne movie. And she was saying it to Donna Reed, who was playing a social worker. And somehow it got into the public domain, and it got attributed to Vince Lombardi, like every comedic thing in sports is attributed to Yogi Berra. If it's motivational or about winning, it's attributed to Vince Lombardi. So I wasn't sure about him, but in the end, so many of those contradictions I didn't hate him, because Lombardi was incredibly strong on race relations and even gender. When he got to Green Bay, he went to every tavern in town and said, if I hear you discriminating against any of my players, you're off limits for all of them. So every African-American guy who played for Lombardi loved him. For years. I mean, they hated him on a daily basis because he was so hard, but they really respected and loved him in the long run. And similarly, when he got to Washington, one of their top draft choice was gay. And Lombardi told his assistant coaches, if I hear any of you ragging on him, you're fired. And it turned out two of the personnel people were also gay. But Lombardi had always suffered, he felt, from discrimination. And it turned out that his brother was gay. So he had a very deep personal connection to it, as probably most people do in some way or another. But nonetheless, those factors led me to admire Lombardi, even as there were parts of him that I didn't. Clemente, I didn't find anything that I could really not like. I mean, he was no saint, but he was a beautiful human being and ball player. So, I'm lucky I haven't hit that wall in any of my books yet.
Again, I've enjoyed your talk very much. I was wondering, in your exploration of the industry, the auto industry out of Detroit, you talked about the T word, which I would say is technology. But do you have any observations about trade policy and how that has also had an impact on what happened to Detroit and the unions?
Sir, I could answer that question, but it wouldn't be out of a place of expertise, because in 1963, actually, both Walter Reuther and Henry Ford II supported, or earlier, I should say, 62, supported President Kennedy's first sort of open trade policy. So I think that all of those difficulties came during the later fights, which, David Halberstam wrote a book, The Reckoning, about the 80s and Japan and all of that. And it was really much more central to that period than the period that I know something about. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, I just don't want to give a stupid answer. Thanks.
There was an interesting point that you had mentioned earlier about urban renewal in Detroit.
Right.
You had a conversation with a minister, an elderly minister, who held out a map and none of the black churches or none of the black institutions were on there. Can you talk about that conversation and what happened with that?
Sure. It was at the Plymouth Church in an area that had been redeveloped. So it was a new church that he eventually built, not quite where the old one was. He was 90 years old. His son was the minister at the time when I interviewed Reverend Hood. He went on, he was so first inspired by the Walk to Freedom and then angered by what happened, that he went on to become elected to the city council in Detroit. I mean, he's a character, he's a figure in my book. If there's something I'm not saying, tell me.
The idea of urban renewal took place
Oh.
in none of these institutions.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, in Black Detroit, it was called Negro removal, not urban renewal. And so many of the institutions were uprooted without really, if you give planners the benefit and the powers that be the benefit of the doubt, maybe they had good intentions. I don't think so in all respects. I think they just said, we can, this area is a mess. Let's just tear it up. This is where we can put the freeways. These people won't protest as much, or they don't have the political power to stop us from doing it. So we're going to put the Chrysler Freeway right through the heart of their neighborhood, and that's what they did.
Even though the branch in NAACP was the largest I think in the country at that time, they still didn't feel like they had the power.
Well, they didn't have, and they had elected Jerome Kavanaugh, but this all happened a little bit before that, in the late 50s, or most of it did. There's still a lot of urban renewal going on after that, but the key decisions were made in the 1950s, and before they had much political clout at all. And even in 1963, of the 7 council people, 1 was African American. So they were relatively powerless. The NAACP history in Detroit is also interesting because it was very conservative in that era. And for a lot of reasons, some of which had just to do with Reverend Franklin's personality, they opposed the Walk to Freedom. They were also fighting, the NAACP at large was competing with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Dr. King for money and prestige, and so there was a lot of natural tension there. But much to the embarrassment of the Reverend Wendell Anthony, who's the head of the NAACP in Detroit today, they opposed the most famous march for civil rights in Detroit history.
And that's where Dr. King had the practice run.
Yeah, of course, if you lived in Detroit, then you knew about it because 150,000 people walking down Woodward Avenue is a big story. Interestingly, when King delivered the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, the Washington Post story missed it entirely. Their entire story doesn't have any of the riffs of I Have a Dream. In Detroit, they got it. So kudos to the Detroit newspapers. They just had a little of it. But he delivered it there first. And it was the first large public setting where he'd given that speech, and it's actually in the text. And many of the riffs, they're not quite as poetic as they were in Washington 2 months later, but they're there. And another interesting fact is that Berry Gordy recorded it. So it brings some of the, Walter Reuther walked arm in arm with Dr. King and Reverend Franklin, and Mayor Kavanaugh was there, and Berry Gordy recorded it. So almost all of the figures in my book are at that one event.
One last thing that I thought was fascinating about that time period was when Dr. King delivered his speech in D.C., Malcolm X gave the rebuttal in Detroit.
He did. The message from the grassroots. Well, he gave several rebuttals, but the most famous was in November. The message from the grassroots, considered one of the doctrinal texts of Malcolm X's life, was in Detroit. He had a very strong Detroit connection too. His brother Wilfred X was the head of the temple in Detroit. One of Malcolm X's nicknames was Detroit Red. Mm-hmm. He had lived there. He worked on the same assembly line that Berry Gordy did, the Mercury line, for a little while. So there were a lot of connections. But yeah, that was a very, very powerful speech and very, very hard on King and on Walter Reuther. He basically said that the whole March on Washington was controlled by Reuther and white establishment. Mm-hmm. and that King was their lackey, basically.
Fascinating stuff. The book, Once in a Great City, Detroit Story, it's totally awesome. I've been reading, I haven't read the whole thing yet, but as a Detroiter, I'd say I absolutely love it, and I think if you're not from Detroit, you will love it too. It's completely fascinating. Thank you, David, very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks to both David and to LZ for the conversation. David, I'm going to allow you, if you don't mind, to make your way over to the solarium where you can position yourself to sign books. And while he does so, let me just say as a reminder to those of you who may not be aware, tomorrow night we will be back at the Institute of Politics for another conversation with another prominent journalist. Ted Koppel will be here to talk about his newest book, Lights Out. It's an investigation into the impact of a cybersecurity attack on the United States and the degree to which we're not prepared for that possible calamity. So he'll be here in conversation with his former ABC News Nightline colleague, Chris Bury, who's based here in Chicago, as some of you know. Also looking ahead to Thursday of this week, Garry Kasparov, the world Grand chess champion, will be here to talk about contemporary Russia and his forays into politics and his own perspective on Vladimir Putin's regime. That'll take place at noon on Thursday. Next week, we'll have a number of other events as well, including next Thursday, an event taking you inside life in Iran. So all of those can be discovered more in greater detail on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. Thank you all so much for being here. Books are available for purchase and signing in the lobby. Thank you all so much. LZ, thank you again.